Hello and welcome to the first of two training videos for Symbiotic Schoolyard. This video is going to focus on how to prepare for the restoration project. My name is Jannica Peterson. I am the creator of Symbiotic Schoolyard. I have a master's in science curriculum and instruction from the University of Washington. I'm a former middle school science classroom teacher, and I have many years teaching environmental education, and I'm really passionate about supporting you. Today, this video is about an overview, sort of a really big overview of Symbiotic Schoolyard. We're going to do a brief ecosystem restoration 101, and then we're going to get into a step-by-step guide for how to prepare for the restoration project. And I use the term restoration project and planting project pretty interchangeably throughout this video. There are two core components to Symbiotic Schoolyard. The first is the restoration project, which is a native planting project in your schoolyard led by you, the teacher, in partnership with a volunteer expert partner. And we'll talk about that later in this video. The second component is the curriculum, or the Schoolyard Habitat Restoration Unit. So this will take you probably 5 or 6 weeks to teach. It's an ecosystem unit, and it can take the place of your existing ecosystem unit. In fact, I recommend that you do that. All the standards are the ecosystem standards for middle school. And it's taught by you, the classroom teacher. Your students will take on the role of restoration ecologists to figure out how to increase the biodiversity of your schoolyard. This video is going to focus on the restoration project. The second video is an overview of the Schoolyard Habitat Restoration Unit, a lesson-by-lesson overview. But I do want to very briefly talk about the unit because it'll help ground this video. So during the unit, students take on the role of restoration ecologists to figure out a challenge. How can we increase the biodiversity of our schoolyard? So this challenge and driving question drives all the learning in the unit. Every one of the 13 lessons ties back to this question and gives students some evidence in order to figure out this challenge. By the end of the unit, students figure out that native plant communities form the foundation of complex food webs. And they actually create a food web model that looks a bit like this. And so they figure out that planting native plants in the schoolyard increases biodiversity. That's really the meat of the unit. And before I continue, I want to just acknowledge that being a Symbiotic Schoolyard teacher is ambitious. And it's entirely possible and worth it. I have supported a lot of teachers in doing this, and they have all been so excited and really noticed high student engagement. So it really is worth the effort. And the first year, like any new project in curriculum, is always the hardest, of course. My hope is that this video will make preparation for the restoration project easier. And also just want to know, everything I cover in this video is also in the written preparation guide in the unit folder. And I also want to point out that the curriculum has everything you need to teach. So hopefully, for those 6 weeks, you're not doing any lesson planning on weekends. I also want to offer you an idea that to help you kind of ease into Symbiotic Schoolyard, and that is to consider just teaching the unit and not actually carrying out the restoration project your first year. So you'd go through the whole unit, have students, make observations of a restoration site in your schoolyard, and do the whole unit, but don't actually carry out the restoration project. Don't actually plant plants your first year. And of course, it's more exciting if students get to plant some native plants as part of this, but for your first year, just easing in, it's totally fine to not actually carry out the restoration project. And this gives you another year to, to plan and to get ready to actually carry out a restoration project your second year. So that's just a good option. Okay, so we are going to do an intro to ecosystem restoration. This is kind of a crash course, and we're going to take on the lens of ecosystem restoration as a solution to the biodiversity crisis. As you may know, ecosystem restoration is also a solution to climate change because plants sequester carbon dioxide, but we're not going to focus on that in this presentation because that's not the focus of the Schoolyard Habitat Restoration Unit. The focus of the curriculum is in restoration as a solution to the biodiversity crisis. Okay, and why does it matter? Why should you and your students care about increasing the biodiversity of your schoolyard? Well, biodiversity is under threat, and it's under threat globally and in your bioregion, everywhere. So you and your students may have seen some recent headlines in the news about how biodiversity is declining. And these are slides that you share with your students on the first day. So ecosystem restoration is one solution to the biodiversity crisis. So what is ecosystem restoration? Ecological restoration is the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. And there are many different ways to restore an ecosystem. So you may be familiar with the reintroduction of wolves in Yellowstone. That's an example of ecosystem restoration when you restore a predator to an ecosystem. Another type of restoration is removing a dam that is blocking a river from its natural flow, and that allows salmon, for example, here in the Pacific Northwest to migrate up the river. So there are many forms, ways to restore an ecosystem, but the kind of restoration that Symbiotic Schoolyard is all about is restoring diverse native plant communities with the goal of increasing biodiversity. And that's where it gets back to students learn that native plants support complex food webs. So if we plant native plants in our schoolyard, we can increase biodiversity by restoring a complex food web. Okay, so how is ecosystem restoration a solution to the biodiversity crisis? I kind of just said it, but I'm going to play this short video which answers that question in more detail. So this video focused on native meadowscaping, which is one kind of restoration, but the concept applies to any kind of planting project of native plants. So planting native plants is a solution to the biodiversity crisis because it restores complex food webs. So in restoration ecology, there are two terms that are very important. And the first is a restoration site. So this is a degraded, damaged, or destroyed ecosystem that restoration ecologists are working to restore. And another really important concept is a reference ecosystem or reference site. This is a healthy ecosystem that restoration ecologists study and use as a guide for planning an ecosystem restoration plan for the restoration site, in particular, coming up with a plant list for the restoration site. And these are two terms that are going to be really important for you as a teacher because you're going to need to identify a restoration site and a reference site. And these are terms that students are going to apply and use in the unit. So we'll get more into these in just a little bit. So that was a crash course. Obviously, there is a lot more to learn about ecosystem restoration. It's a really exciting field, and I really recommend that you do some self-directed exploration and learn more. Here are some ways that you can learn more about it. And if I were to recommend just one of these, it would be the book Nature's Best Hope by Doug Tallamy. It's a really excellent book, pretty easy read, pretty short, but it's an overview of the relationship between native plants, insect populations, bird populations, and ecosystem health, and how planting native plants is a solution to the biodiversity crisis. So reading Nature's Best Hope will give you, as teacher, a really good scientific understanding going into the unit. Okay, I'll be quiet for a minute while you read this quote that I love from Robin Wall Kimmerer. Okay, so the steps, how to prepare for the restoration project. And again, this video is, I'm hoping that I can help set you up for planning for the restoration project. The other video gets into a lesson by lesson overview of the unit. So here's an overview of the steps. First, you're going to find yourself a volunteer expert partner or take a class. Then you're going to identify a restoration site. You're going to identify a reference site or reference ecosystem. You'll order plants for your project, figure out where you can borrow tools from. And finally, you're going to make the ecosystem card set, which your students will use throughout the unit. So before we get into the steps, what kind of project works with the Symbiotic Schoolyard unit? So as I said before, as long as your project involves planting native plants, planting a variety of native plants, it will work with the curriculum. There are many different flavors of native plant projects. You may be familiar with the Miyawaki method, also known as tiny forests, rewilding, pollinator gardens, native landscaping, habitat or wildlife restoration, creating a bird or butterfly garden, or native meadowscaping. So these are all flavors. They all involve planting native plants. So whatever you want to call it, if you're really excited about a tiny forest or using the term rewilding or pollinator garden, you can kind of use any of these terms if they speak to you more or if you're more familiar with them. All of these involve planting native plants and will work with the curriculum. Okay, so the first step, and this is an important one, is to find yourself a volunteer expert partner. So you want someone who can help you design and carry out the restoration project or planting project in your schoolyard. So unless you happen to have lots of experience with native plants and doing restoration, and maybe you don't need an expert partner, but probably you do need one. So this person can help you identify a restoration site in your schoolyard. They'll help you choose plants, and they'll help you actually carry out the project with students, being present, hopefully, on planting day and any other restoration days. So where do you find this wonderful person who's going to help you? There are different options, and these are just some ideas of where you might look for this person. The kind of first most obvious one is if your school or if your district has a garden teacher or garden coordinator. So this person, you can approach them and say, hey, we want to plant native plants in our schoolyard. You will need to explain to them that this is not, they're not planting it. You're not wanting to plant an edible garden with vegetables, but a edible garden for wildlife, so a native plant garden. And it's very possible your school garden teacher will be familiar with native plants. Or you might need to educate them a little, but see if you can get them to help you. They might have a budget, they have experience planting. So they're within your school, they're paid. So if you can get them to help you, that is probably the easiest. If you do not have a school garden teacher at your school or your district, you need to look in the outside community, outside of your school, for someone who can help you. So see if there's a master gardener program in your area. Master gardeners don't necessarily focus on native plants, but a lot of them do. And more master garden programs are increasing education on the importance of native plants. So reach out, see if you can find a local master gardener who's knowledgeable and excited about native plants specifically. Another option is just to send out an email to all of your students' parents. Say, hey, is there anyone who is a restoration ecologist who has planted a pollinator garden before, is a master gardener, and who would be interested in helping me and my students plant a native plant garden? You might have a parent who has the skills and enthusiasm to help you. Another option is to see if there are any local nonprofits who are involved in habitat restoration, ideally with schools, but not necessarily, and see if they would be willing. A lot of local nonprofits, their dream project is to plant a native plant in a school because they want to work with kids and they see how impactful that is. So see if there's a local nonprofit involved in habitat restoration or whatever their flavor is. They might call it pollinator gardens. It might be, the Audubon Society who's creating bird habitat. So they might call it something different, or they might be, creating Milwaukee tiny forests. But as long as they know how to plant native plants, they can be your volunteer expert partner. The last option, and there might be other ideas you have of people or organizations you can reach out to. Finally, you can take a class and learn these skills yourself. So there's a growing movement now about native plants, and there are online and in-person classes available in most areas now to teach you about how to plant native plants. And it's mostly people who want to do it in their own yards, but you can take a class and become an expert yourself, and maybe you can convince one of the other students in the class to help you out, you and your students out. I will say I recommend taking a class that is really specific to your bioregion so that you can focus on the unique plants in your area and the unique considerations for a restoration project where you live. Okay, so once you have your volunteer expert partner, it's time to identify a restoration site. First thing you're going to do is set up a meeting with your volunteer expert partner, your principal, and your head of maintenance staff to walk around your schoolyard to see if you guys can come up with some potential restoration sites together. So you want to look for areas that are overgrown with invasive plants or weeds, have no existing vegetation, such as gravel, or just bare dirt. Lawns make great restoration sites, so they can be harder to convince administrators to let you plant in lawns. And pavement works. You can do native container gardening. It's really important that you include all the stakeholders in this initial meeting from the get-go. So, definitely invite your principal, definitely invite the head of maintenance staff, but there might be others within the district who you think should be invited. See, there might be someone in the district who is excited about native plants. Get them on your team. Invite them to that meeting. They might be an ally. And it's extremely important that you involve maintenance. Number one, because when you're identifying a restoration site, they can tell you if the restoration site is on top of utilities. You definitely don't want it on top of any electrical lines or water lines. So they're really helpful with that. And they might be an ally to you, the maintenance staff. They also might be really concerned because they might think that you planting native plants is going to create more work for them. So you might just have to persuade them that no, it won't. We will take care of this site, me and my students. So if there are no restoration sites in your schoolyard, and by the way, you can work with really small areas, and we'll get into that in the next slide, but your restoration site does not have to be a big area. But if there really are no good candidates in your schoolyard, try walking around or see if there's a park nearby. So if you are in walking distance of a park, this can be a really ideal partnership. So You can get in touch with the park staff and see if there's an area of the park that's overgrown by invasives or is lawn that the park wants to restore biodiversity to by planting native plants. Partnering with a park is great because you have help of the park staff. Likely they have restoration expertise. They have tools you can use. They might have a budget for plants. And you don't have to deal with the, getting permission to change your schoolyard. So if there's a park in walking distance, I might even recommend that that's the first you go to, even maybe over a schoolyard restoration site, but that's up to you. If there's no park in walking distance, if you don't have any restoration sites in your schoolyard, you can still do this. Try walking around your neighborhood. Is there a road divider or sidewalk curb that is overgrown with invasives or lawn that you could plant some native plants in? Maybe there's a local business in walking distance with an overgrown area of weeds that could become a pollinator garden. And here are just some photos of, good potential restoration site candidates. So lawn, pavement for container gardening, gravel, and depending where you are, you might have to scrape away the gravel, or in some regions you can actually plant in the gravel, or an area overgrown by invasive species such as English ivy or another type of invasive species. So let's talk about the size of your restoration site. The size is really flexible, and it just depends on what's available, what kind of land is available in your schoolyard, the number of students you have, your budget for plants, and whether you want to save some land in your schoolyard for future restoration sites. You might want to do Symbiotic Schoolyard for many years, so you might want to just focus on one area at a time. So you want to save land for future restoration sites. So one way to think about this is, do you want to have a restoration site that is enough space for each student to plant one plant, or each pair of students to plant one plant, or 3 students collaborating to plant one plant as they're doing in this photo? You can even have 4 or 6 students work together to plant one plant, so you can have a pretty small restoration site. And native plants are typically spaced 3 to 5 feet apart, with trees needing more space. But your volunteer expert partner can help you with this. So if you kind of come up with your restoration site, your volunteer expert partner should say, okay, I think we can fit about X number of plants in this space. Okay, so now you've identified your restoration site. It's time to identify a reference site or a reference ecosystem. And again, this is an important principle of restoration, is the identification of a reference ecosystem to serve as a guide for the restoration site, in particular in coming up with a plant list for your restoration site. So you're referencing a healthy ecosystem to restore your restoration site. So your reference site should ideally be a natural area with a diversity of native plants, either in your schoolyard, that's ideal, or in walking distance of your school. So, different schools have different, you may or may not have a natural area with a diversity of native plants. It doesn't need to be a perfect, beautiful, diverse ecosystem in your schoolyard. Work with what you've got. As long as there are at least 6 native plants present, maybe if you could get away with 4 native plants present, it will work as a reference site. Work with what you've got. So ideally, this is really ideal, at least a few of the native plants in the reference site are plants you plan on also planting in your restoration site. And it's likely that will be the case, because there will probably be common native plants growing in your reference site. And it's likely you would be planting common native plants in your restoration site. So if there are no native plants, not a one, in your schoolyard or in walking distance, consider a field trip to a local park where you can use the native plants in that park. So if a field trip is not possible, that's okay. You can bring in plant samples, or you can do a PowerPoint presentation on the native plants. or use photos, in a PowerPoint, and adapt lesson 3 and 4 in the unit accordingly. Lesson 3 and 4 in the unit make use of a reference ecosystem. So if there really are no native plants in your schoolyard or in walking distance, you can still do this. You just have to adapt lesson 3 and 4 in the unit, which make use of the reference ecosystem. Okay, what time of year should you do Symbiotic Schoolyard? So consult with your volunteer expert partner about the best time to plant native plants where you live. Often it's fall. Here on the West Coast, it's fall because the plants then take advantage of the rainy winter to establish their root systems before the dry summers. But here in the West, we can plant all the way through April. And you want to begin the unit 6 weeks before planting day. So this allows you to finish the unit in time for planting. And the timing, there may be other restoration activities that your volunteer expert partner recommends, such as removing the invasives first before planting your natives, if there are invasives, or mulching. And the timing of those is flexible with the unit, so they can happen sort of during the unit if there are things that need to happen before planting, or they can happen all after the unit. But the most important thing is that you set your planting day and then begin the unit 6 weeks before planting day. Okay. You're going to need tools. You and your students need tools. So probably at the very least, you need shovels, but consult with your volunteer expert partner about which tools you and your students will need. I don't recommend buying tools. They're expensive and they require storage. So to avoid purchasing them, see if you can borrow tools from a local park or local nonprofit, or send an email to parents to see if parents can bring in tools. And you really don't need one tool per student. So you'll be doing these restoration days during your science period, most likely. So you only have 50 minutes or however long your science period is. So, so if you have 30 students per class, I don't recommend that you have 30 tools. I recommend that maybe you have 5 or 10 shovels, because students can share tools and they can do different tasks within those 50 minutes. So maybe you have, a pair of students planting together. One of them is using a shovel to dig a hole, and the other one is taking the plant out of the pot and massaging the roots before planting. So they can share tools. I don't recommend one tool per student. It's a lot of storage, cleaning, and management. And if you do borrow tools, just be sure to return them clean. So, wash off or brush off any dirt is really nice. Okay, so now you're ready to order plants. Consult with your volunteer expert partner to choose the plants, to choose 6 species or more of native plants for your restoration site. It's important to choose native plants that will survive and thrive at your site, given the soil type and abiotic conditions, like the amount of sunlight your restoration site gets and how moist or dry the soil is. So your volunteer expert partner should help you or determine the plant list. And also take into consideration things like if you don't want to plant a baby tree that's going to become a big tree too close to a building, right? Because it could interfere with the foundation. So hopefully your volunteer expert partner is really an expert on that. And they'll know, plant placement and all that. But this is where you might want to bring in your maintenance staff person again and include them in this conversation. Potted plants work really well, but you can also, like in this photo, but you can also do live stakes, bare roots, this unit also works with direct seeding. So if your restoration site is a native wildflower meadow and you're just seeding seeds, this unit also works. So I encourage you to ask for plant donations from local native plant nurseries or discounts. A lot of plant nurseries are really excited to donate or at least discount native plants if you tell them this is for a school project. Okay, we're getting towards the end here. So now you are ready to make your ecosystem cards for your students to use during the unit. So I recommend that you do this well ahead of time. Don't save this for the night before you start teaching the unit, and give yourself several hours to do this. So these ecosystem cards are a set of organism cards that you make that have the plants and animals from your bioregion. And it's a plug and play that works really well. It's how this Symbiotic Schoolyard unit is customizable to any bioregion in the country. So you're going to customize, you're going to create your own set of ecosystem cards. But I have templates in the unit and I have detailed instructions about how to make these cards. So hopefully it'll be pretty straightforward and kind of fun. Sort of a fun, if you're not familiar with the plants and animals in your bioregion, it's a really fun way to learn about them. So, once you have your restoration site identified and you've chosen your 6 native plants, at least for the restoration site, you're ready to make the ecosystem cards. I should clarify that's 6 species of native plants, not necessarily 6 plants total. And again, you can use the card template and instructions found in the unit folder. So groups of 4 students work together throughout the unit, and these groups will each group will have their own ecosystem card set printed out in color. And they use this card set in multiple lessons throughout the unit. This card set is a key tool that groups use to figure out their challenge, right? Because by the end, they show how native plants support a complex food web using this ecosystem card set. But there's lots of steps in between to get there. Okay. So again, brief overview of the steps. First, find yourself a volunteer expert partner, or find a class offered locally where you can learn the skills to be your own expert. Second, identify a restoration site. Make sure you invite your principal, maintenance staff, and of course, your volunteer expert partner. Third is identify a reference site or reference ecosystem with at least a few native plants in your schoolyard or in walking distance of your schoolyard. Order plants, and you want, ideally at least 6 different species of native plants. Borrow tools, figure out where you can borrow tools from. And finally, make your ecosystem card set and make that ecosystem card set well ahead of time, well before beginning the unit. Okay, so another step is you want to familiarize yourself with the unit. So to familiarize yourself with the unit, I recommend that you watch the Symbiotic Schoolyard unit overview video, which is the second of the 2 training videos. This is the first. And you can also read the unit at a glance and unit overview in the teacher guide. So that will really help orient you to the unit. And that's going to be, I recommend doing that sooner rather than later, because having a good grasp of the curriculum is going to help you see how the restoration project fits with the curriculum. So thank you so much for your time. And you can watch the second video when you're ready. And good luck.